Hello, welcome back to the Obligations of Memory podcast. I'm Jeffrey Geisner for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and YouTube. And we're back with our third episode with Yifat Meir Cohen. Yifat Cohn-Meir, sorry.
Fine, same.
And she's coming from Israel, and we're talking about mostly about her father as a survivor whose book is under author of Thomas Geves, The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz, and we're using that as a jumping point to discuss quite a few other topics. We're in the middle of discussing Holocaust, the ability to use art and to educate. Before we go there, I'm just curious, I know you're taking up your father's torch. You do a lot of Holocaust education in Israel with students and children and probably adults. And I wanted to kind of know, when you talk to your father, you mentioned in the last episode that you just talked to your father on this topic 2 weeks ago, what it's like to speak to your father, someone who went through the Holocaust, who can tell you what he experienced, as opposed to, for instance, my parents were both survivors and absolutely refused to speak about anything about the Holocaust. So I'm curious what it does for your father to be able to tell you, and in turn, what it does for you to be able to receive it, that information that's priceless. And you are part of the future of making sure that the Holocaust lessons live on. So please, I would love to hear your take on that question.
First of all, I'm very fortunate. My father is 92 and he's very clear in his mind, and he shares now, opposed to our early years. In the beginning, he didn't talk at all to us about the Holocaust and his experiences. He was only starting to share his becoming an active witness on his 50s, in the 1990s, and in Europe, not in Israel. And it was always, his own separate thing. He didn't want us to be part of that. He was not appearing much in Israel, and he didn't want us to go with him. He needed his peace and quiet when he went to those journeys. It was not easy on him, but he did it. He felt the urge to be a witness. But for him, it was easier to cope with it when this was separate from his private life. He also, as I mentioned in the last episode, he was living under two names. He had his original name, which he kept on living with and living by, and then he had his pseudonym that escorted his life as a witness under the pseudonym as Thomas Geves. So his identity, he gave himself the other name, Thomas Geves, at the age of 16. So most of his life, he was, it's part of his identity in any way. But so it was quite late when he started to talk to me directly about his events. And that happens when, like 8 years ago, he was invited to Germany to another tour. He usually went 2-3 times a year to Europe, mainly Germany. And that time, I was invited as well. And it was a bit hard for him, but good friends from Germany, they kind of explained him that it's important for them that I would join him. And that was the first time he actually agreed that any one of us would come along. And I was extremely fortunate to do that, because actually that was his last visit to Europe. After that, he didn't go
to Europe. What were some of your impressions of that trip?
That was an amazing, life-changing trip, of course. First, to see, the respect. My father is very modest, and in Germany, he was such a respectful person, and everyone honored him. And the reactions, to see the reactions of people to his story, and hear him for the first time, giving the testimony. And
what organizations in Germany was he talking to?
Various. There was schools, and there were community centers and and churches and synagogues and city halls, different. There was one in the Kristallnacht. They have a project. One of the, they have like a, I don't know, call it in Germany. You have parts of Germany, and where we were, they have a project every year. The Kristallnacht, they do like a whole night on like cultural things and talking about the variety, tolerance and those very important topics. And he was invited to speak there. It was just amazing. First to see him doing it, hearing him, but after that excitement, the other thing that excited me very much was to see the young students so excited by him and so interested with his story and asking all those questions. That was so moving. And also he his book was published in Germany, and every time he went to those meetings and testimonies, on the end of the meeting, there was another guy who sold those books. So they asked the children who wanted to buy the book, or teachers, they bought the book, and then they were queuing to get my father's signature, and that was amazing. I took endless photos of those moments again and again in different places, because that kept repeating. And for me, that was amazing, to see the next generation. And I know most of them were not Jewish. Many of them were immigrants. It didn't matter who they were. All sorts of teenagers were all interested to know about the past and moved by my father, were really excited by his figure.
So now you are doing the presentations mostly in place of your father. Is there a difference in your reaction that you get versus the reaction that you saw your father get?
Obviously, there's nothing like, meeting a real Holocaust survivor. That's a completely different thing. His story is fascinating. And again, as I mentioned when we started this talk before about the arts, the way he decided to express his experiences through arts, through drawings, that made a huge difference, because that my work is so much easier, because I just have an amazing display of his drawings, and I talk through the drawings. I tell the story by his drawings. So it's fascinating, see drawings. I could be very boring. I try not to be boring, but it doesn't matter, because the drawings just speak for themselves. And we have the quotes from the books. So, but my father, when he was there, you could see the excitement of people just by him being a Holocaust survivor. And I can give one amazing example. A few years ago, there was a very known artist, a photographer, who came to Yad Vashem, and he did a project for the 70 years of liberation of the camps. He did a special project. He took photographs of Holocaust survivors in Israel, and he interviewed them. And there was supposed to be a big exhibition of their photos and their stories. Then came COVID, so it wasn't really on the way they planned, but that's not the story. With my father, because my father's art is displayed in Yad Vashem, they met at Yad Vashem. So the other Holocaust survivors were interviewed, but with my father, he took a journey to the museum to look at his art with all the camera team. So we were walking down in a kind of a corridor in Yad Vashem to another part where the art is, and tourists came by, and there was a group of quite young tourists, I think they were quite young. And as we walked with that photographer and my father, and someone was filming them walking together, and I saw that group of young people staring at them and kind of, talking to each other with lots of excitement. And we went on, and I didn't understand that they were not speaking English. And then I told the photographer, I see you're a celebrity. Those kids recognized you, and they were really, really excited to see you. And then the photographer said, they were not excited by me. They were excited by your father. They were talking about how exciting he is because they saw his tattoo, so they understood he's a Holocaust survivor. They were just excited to see him, and that made such a huge impression. You know, I was so moved by that.
So when you do your talks now about the art and you speak to your father, does he ever go with you and listen to your presentation?
Yes, sometimes he does. Well, thanks to the art. I mean, the art was like a magic. That the art is such an amazing thing. The effect of his art is huge. And one of the things, you know, we never talked about the Holocaust between us. So the first, as I said, the first time was me joining him, talking to others. But then we came back, and after a while, when he decided that he's not traveling to Europe anymore because of his age and other reasons, so we persuaded him to start and give his testimonies in Yad Vashem, because okay, you're not going to Europe, but Europe is coming to Yad Vashem. There are groups coming all the time to Yad Vashem, and he liked that. So for quite a few years, he gave his testimonies in Yad Vashem to groups coming in German or in English, and I started to join him. To, you know, it was getting older then, and I just thought for him is just to go with him, and for me it was a huge opportunity just to join him. And so I had another opportunity, more and more opportunities to speak, to hear him speaking. Here, every testimony he gave, there were other questions. You know, the end of every testimony is questions and answers and questions, and every time different questions came, and each testimony, something new came up. Every time there was something, a new information came up. And with time, I started to write down everything, because I felt, you know, we need to keep that, because he's not repeating himself. Every time he brings something else. And later on, I thought of an idea. It was just before COVID, like a year before. I thought, my father moved away he lives in a home now and was further away. I live in Haifa, and he's now not living next to me anymore. So I thought that would be an amazing thing, that I could go there, good excuse to visit. And I thought we should just go on working with his testimony. And I figured out that his drawings, when he did those drawings, there are lots of written information on the drawings as well, all in his handwriting and all in German. And as I mentioned in the last episode, the drawings are on postcards, and they're quite miniature. Most of them are about 10 to 15 centimeters. So the details are sometimes really miniature, and it's hard to understand, especially we wanted to start and translate everything, because my kids are Israelis, and okay, they can understand English, but they don't know German. And we thought this testimony is a way to expose this to more audiences. So we started a project. We met every week or two, and each time I enlarged those drawings in an A4 scale. And we went through the drawings. He started I gave him a transparent paper, and I asked him to cover all the German words in his own handwriting, so it would be very authentic, and just to translate them into English. It was a bit tough for him to write over his own work, but although it was a copy and it was transparent paper, but he did that in the end. And I think that's extremely important. And once he went doing that, we met and we started to speak about those drawings, because as we went on doing it, I figured out there's much more information on those drawings that we know, because he did write a book, and the book was actually based on those 80 drawings. That was the beginning of his memoirs. When he was just 17, 18, he started to write down a little bit about each drawing, and that actually added up to be a book. And a few years later, he added more scenes, like dialogues and all sorts of speeches he had, and more information. But as we went on talking about the drawings, I found that he has more and more information coming. And also I actively asked more questions about holes in the information we had. personally about our own family and also about the drawings. So the drawings were actually a base of conversation between us. So I think that really helped my father to open up and tell stories, because he's just explaining his drawings. And for me, it was an amazing base to ask questions. But of course, our conversation were going further around, not just about the specific drawing. It came also for my father, you know, he was already almost 90 then. And the way the drawings woke up his memory to other details. More, you know, his brain is very clever and his brain is full of details. Still, up to this day, we keep on surprising us with more details. And you completely 100% count on his memory. He's very sharp. So, a very also accurate. So if he says something, you can check it out, but he's always right. We never find something, he was never confused about something. So it's amazing. It's like still open book. He keeps on telling us stories.
So I'm curious, when you give a presentation and he attends your presentation, what does the post conversation look like when you're doing his presentation?
Well, it's quite similar nowadays. I try as much as possible. Now, we had 2 years of COVID, which was very, very challenging because because he's living in a home. I couldn't sit by him. Mm-hmm. And of course, we didn't want him to appear. Now we started to work through Zooms. And it was impossible to sit with a mask on, not for him and not for us. So we tried to figure out ways. So I started to record him. And as much as possible, we did sit together, we Zoomed together. But also when, you know, with years, it was more and more tiring for him to do the whole presentation. Usually it's about an hour and a half with his display and then the explanation. Now, his display, also when he went to Europe, it was either a film, there's a documentary film done in 97 by Wilhelm Rosing, is a documentary producer in Germany, and he made a documentary about my father and his drawings and his story, filming him in Germany, talking to his son.
Do you know the name of that?
Nothing But Life. That's the name of the film, and you can still get it online through Wilhelm Rosing website. Amazing documentary and many questions and answers. But so sometimes they show the documentary and afterwards my father was answering questions, or my late brother, he made a display of some of his drawings and he went with that. Sometimes he used the display, just showing some of his drawings, talking about them, and then having questions and answers. So that became, later on when he started to speak just in Israel, it was not the film anymore, it was just display of the drawings. So when COVID came, and also when in Israel we have a project that it's called Memory in Your Living Room. It's a project we do every year around the Holocaust Memorial Day. Israel has a different date. And the idea was to get Holocaust survivors, the one who we still have with us, to come in and tell their own personal stories in a very small groups, personal connection with those Holocaust survivors. Everything is, many times it's recorded, but he started to participate with these. But in COVID times, I started to go because he could not go around. So I used the same technique. I made a display starting with photos of his early years before the war. We have some photos. So I tell the background of his life before the war. And then all those 2 years during the Holocaust, during the camps, the children or my audience, they see the display of some of his drawings, and I keep on changing every audience. I change it a little bit through, depending on who is my audience. Various audiences is fascinating. So I have such a huge selection of drawings, over 80. Oh, now we have 80, and drawings and a whole story, a whole book. So depends on my audience, I can choose what to focus on. And that's amazing because the art carries so many topics and so many different information. So I can't go cover everything. So I try to connect what I display to the right audience. So when my father joined me, usually I do the beginning, the background, and he is doing on his own all the, explaining all the drawings. And then there were questions and answers, and he answers the questions. And if I have something to add, I just add from previous things he said before, in the past. I carry the information, and if I think there's something to add, I just add. But I try to, as much as possible, to keep my father, of course, the center of his own testimony, and keep him busy and carrying on his testimony, because I believe it's nothing like hearing his own voice.
So let me segue to your
testimony.
children. How many children do you have?
3.
Okay, and how old are they?
My youngest daughter, she's 15. My son, he's 20, and my eldest daughter, she's 25.
Okay.
And altogether, my father has 9 grandchildren.
That's terrific.
My daughter, she's the youngest, and the elder granddaughter, she's 30. So in between, he has 9 grandchildren.
So it's obvious to everyone listening is that you have a family who is very close. Now, I'm interested to know how your children has felt about having a father as out, and the teaching that he's doing. Now you are doing the teaching. So what is their impression, and how did they learn about your father's Holocaust? Now, you didn't learn it until you were 20, but I'm sure that they were much younger when they learned about it. And they're also, as you said, in Israel, it's all around you. So help us understand the next generation, your children, how they're impacted by the story.
So as you mentioned, first of all, for them, when they were born, we already knew the stories, my father's story. And also he was more open to talk about things, and he was already an active witness at that time. Started to be when the first one were born. So everything was more open. And also the books were there's album, it's called No Children Here. The album, Buchenwald produced an album with all of his drawings. So every house has the album. So they had an opportunity to look at it. When they were old enough, like end of their primary schools, when the Holocaust Memorial Day came, I talk about my own personal children. I offered each of them if they want me to come over and show some of the drawings, because one of the things, I didn't mention it yet, but the whole tool that we have now with the drawings as an educational tool, it's amazing what we can do with that. And one of the things is that we can approach a younger audience, which is always a challenge with Holocaust education. How do we approach the younger listeners? So because one part of his testimony is drawn, and is also drawn by a young boy, some of the drawings are easier to show the younger generation children as well. So my eldest daughter, when she was in her 5th grade and also the 6th grade, she made a small display of my father's drawing. We chose, of course, suitable drawings like daily life, a day routine, what they did, what kind of works they did, what they ate, things like details from life that are very interesting for younger children. And of course, it was easier for them to relate to because it was all drawn. And so she did, we together, we wrote few sentences about each drawing. We talked about the drawings. So she made her own testimony for her grandfather's drawings, which was amazing. My son and my other daughters, they didn't feel comfortable to do that. They didn't want to share and they were younger, but they were older. My son, when he was in the end of his high school, in Israel, many of the high schoolers, they go to Poland and go to the camps. By the way, some of the grandchildren felt it was too sensitive for them. They didn't want to go. It was too much for them. They are very sensitive about the topic of the Holocaust. Others felt the urge to go for the same reasons. So my daughter did not go, my first daughter didn't go, and my son did go to Poland. So as part of preparing to that, my father came and spoke to the children.
He was 17, 18?
18, but actually I forgot. When he was 14, where he goes to school, to a special school, and they make lots of interchange, how do you say, groups coming. Yeah. So he went to Germany with a group of other young students from Israel to prepare them, and they met German children, and they kind of mixed. And as preparation for the journey, my father came with his drawings as well. So he was in a junior high school when he first saw, my father doing this testimony to his friends. And he was very attached to the subject, and he was really into that. And when he went to Poland, my father's drawing, some of his drawing, in Poland, in Auschwitz, there's a Jewish block. In the Jewish block, there's one room that is a memorial for the children. And it's an amazing thing they did there. An artist took lots of children's drawings, mostly found in ghettos, and papers and books and notebooks found around the ghettos. Most of those children were perished in the Holocaust. And they collected those drawings. Now, in the camps, people could not draw. But my father was quite unique because he did immediately after liberation, but he was still in a camp. So I think it's one of very rare to find. So they were very impressed by his drawings, and also that because they were very informative. And also the other children's drawing were bits and pieces of drawings, of course. So on that wall, the artist, she copied those drawings on the wall. So you walk in a white room, there's enough blank walls, but on like a snake of drawings, a little drawings of, I don't know, many children. And my father, they chose two big full drawings and also some images from other drawings, and they're part of that wall. Yeah. And one of the images is my father drew the scene of arrival to Auschwitz, the scene on what we call the selection on the ramp, when they just arrived from the train, taken off the train, and how people were selected to life or death. And he drew that scenario. And that is, I say that is taken and drawn on the wall now in Auschwitz. So when my son was there, it was very moving to go through the experience of entering Auschwitz. Now, we lost all of our family. My grandmother, my father's mother, was perished in Auschwitz. And also my other grandparents, my mother's parents, were both perished in Auschwitz. And some of our aunts and uncles and family members. So for us to go there is hugely emotional. And to see his grandfather's drawings, that was very powerful. Experience for him.
That's an amazing story. So let's get back to the art of how you are educating using art to teach the lessons of the Holocaust. And where are you doing it? You're doing it only in Israel, or are you doing it all over the world through Zoom?
Yeah, so as I said, we're very fortunate that my father decided to express his testimony through arts, and that is very powerful nowadays, because one of the challenges is now, educational challenges nowadays, is how do we express the Holocaust, and how do we approach the younger generation? Many people wrote books, but some of the information in the books is really harsh and hard for the younger generation to read. And many of them don't like books anymore, and they look for other ways to educate. And having those drawings it's a real treasure, because as I said, they're informative. You can really learn the history through those drawings. It's not just emotional drawings. They're not emotional. They're very
what age appropriate do you think that book is? So people who are listening to this, when do you feel as an educator that you're now talking to children in schools, when do you think it's appropriate for them to be able to recommend a book like your father's?
Well, my father, as I said, my father's testimony is drawn and written. They complement each other. So the best thing is combine them. But you can change the way you combine them according to the age of the listeners. So in primary school, you can talk, as I mentioned before, you can talk about what we ate and what we did during the day and how we worked and what kind of work we did. You can pick those details that tell about the daily life and also about the bravery of people, how the decision, how they cope with things. You don't talk about the horrors. By the way, my father's testimony, the main emphasis is not about the horrors. They are there. They're obviously there because that was life. But he chose to show more about how they lived, not too much about how they awfully died. But also it's also mentioned there. So if you're a grown-up and you want to know all the details, they are there. But if you're an educator or teacher and you want to share with your children or your students, you can pick what you want because it's very large, very broad. And The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz, the last edition of my father, there were other, it was first published in the 50s under the name Youth in Chains, in 58 in Israel. And there was just a pocketbook without drawings. And then it was published in the 80s in America under the name Youth in Chains. Guns and Barbed Wire. And that book has some of his drawings. But the last one, The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz, was lately published and it has 56 of his drawings. And the same text, all of them, but the drawings are more drawings now. So a teacher can choose what kind of text you want to pick out from the story and what kind of drawing you want to show his student. So you can start at primary school. Some of the materials are suitable. I can give one example.
And for you, primary school is what age?
Well, I wouldn't say the youngest, but from the age, let's say 10, 11, 12,
okay.
You can start. Yes, you can start with certain details and certain drawings and certain quotes from the book. Yes. One drawing, for instance, that you can use for the younger generation, younger children. Thomas wrote one of his drawings. He drew the ABC and a word for each letter. Our life in Auschwitz through the ABC, and each letter present a word that represents something very meaningful in their life in Auschwitz, which is fascinating. But what we do as younger children, we can give them like a game. Take an ABC, take a week, think about your life as a child nowadays in Israel, in America, wherever you live, and write a word that symbolize your life in A, in B, and C, and so on. The kids can do that and look at the life. It's fascinating for them. It's nice. It's funny. It's fun. It's like a game. And then, would you like to see the ABC of Thomas' life when he was in the camps at 13? And then we go through the words. And first of all, it's interesting for them because they can compare their life. So when they're younger, they're just curious. What would Thomas write? And some words they might even find funny. Thomas has, by the way, amazing sense of humor. So it's not shown in the book so much, a little bit, by the way. He also has some humor in the book. But when you talk to him, sometimes he used jokes as well. So children love to listen to him. But even that, they can relate to that, what they can absorb at that age. But this year, I was talking to high schoolers. So when you're 15, when I was talking to 15 years old, I told them, you are a very special audience. By the way, I always tell it to everyone because I do believe every audience is very special because they have a different angle of looking at the story. So I tell them, why are you unique? Because you are the only audience that can really, really relate to what happened to Thomas because he was the same age as you are. And you know what he went through, what he might felt being a 15-year-old boy going through those events. You might understand him in a way that no one other people can understand. So every audience, you know, I was talking to university students. We were picking other things. I had students who were learning about criminology. You say criminology in English?
Yep.
They found amazing angles of the story in the drawings and in the story relating to how do you cope with trauma? How do you cope with trauma as it goes, because it's an ongoing trauma, and how do you live through it, and how do you cope with it afterwards? That was fascinating to them, that part of the story. And each audience finds something else. So both the drawings and the text has very wide range of topics that it relates to, and you can just pick the right thing to your audience. And one of the things we did, Thomas originally did in his first book in the 80s, and then it was taken out. And in this book, we put it back again, was the index. And that was thanks to some advice we got from the wife of Sir Gilbert, who was writing lots of history books. Esther Gilbert, and she kindly mentioned to us that her husband, her late husband, he was a very known writer, Holocaust writer. He always insists to have index in his books. And she said, you know why? Because once you have an index, it changes the role of the book. And your father's testimony could be a good reading book, but once it has the index, it can help educators, it can help researchers, it can help students. And when they're interested in certain topic, they can go through the topic and go through the book, just pick out what they want. And that was an amazing tip, because we brought back the index that Thomas did, and we actually widened it a little bit more into it. And we feel that this book could be really helpful now for educators and students, as to, doesn't matter what their age is, because you can pick the topic that you want to read about and just pick that if you don't want to read the rest.
Well, we've come to another half hour, and it goes so quickly, and it's so interesting and thought-provoking to hear you talk about your father and the work that you're doing. I'm Jeffrey Geisner for the Obligation of Memory podcast for the Jewish Culture and Holocaust Remembrance Group on Facebook and YouTube. We have been speaking with Yifat Cohn-Meir about the book by her father, The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz, which is available on Amazon and other places. You can also see the program that Yifat did with the group, the Holocaust group, on the YouTube channel. The Boy Who Drew Auschwitz was the title of the program. And we'll talk again, Yifat. So
pleasure. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for this opportunity.
All right, hold on.